a tendency to building castles in the air.
What's up? And welcome back to Place of Assembly podcast. This is the podcast where we look at physical space and its role in cultural production. Place of Assembly is produced by Hollow NYC in partnership with Experimental Sound Studio Chicago and 8-Ball Radio. This week on the pod, we've got Michelle Lhooq, legendary journalist, nightlife aficionado, coined or reframed the term CALI sober. She's going to come with deep knowledge about weed, drugs, party space, safe space, politics, and put us on to a lot of things. A lot to think about there. I can tell you firsthand from running spaces, this is not frivolous. This is important. So let's learn from Michelle and get into it. All right. Michelle Lhooq.
Hello.
What's up? How are you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing good. Coming to you from Mexico, San Miguel in the mountains. And I'm reaching out to you in LA, correct?
Yeah, in my new crib in Echo Park. Just moved in like a week ago.
Amazing. Well, congrats and welcome to Place of Assembly, and thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk.
Cool. Yeah, it's been cool talking to you over pandemic, and I'm excited to get into it. So the first thing I do on all of these casts is I have a Place of Assembly question, which I feel like you're going to have a especially really good answer to. And the question is, what is the craziest or most intense or ecstatic, or however you want to take it, but you see what I mean, event that you've ever been a part of where you had some level of responsibility? Like you weren't just there, you were covering it, you were part of it, and somehow you booked somebody, like whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, probably the weed rave that I threw last year around Halloween. It was called Halloween. And it was pretty much like the synthesis of my perfect party that I could dream up. And it was pretty out there. Basically, we had 3 different rooms in like a former weed grow house. So it was like a big ass warehouse with like really high ceilings. And we had like 3 different rooms. One was like the sativa room, one was the indica room, and one was the hybrid room that was kind of outdoors. And I was really trying to like bring together these 2 worlds of like crazy legal cannabis with like underground LA rave, and basically like had all of these weed brands come through and set up little installations and give out like tons of free weed, just like endless bounty abundance. We had DJ Assault play, Camilo, a bunch of other really amazing DJs from LA. And we had like weed edibles and I don't know, like yoga and talks and like, you know, just like all these crazy things. And to me, what was so insane about it is that I have never been to a party that really put weed at the center of everything. Like weed is always peripheral, right? Like it's at every party, you smell it. But I think something really interesting happens when you like make it like the central fuel of a party. Like it completely shifts the dynamic. So to me, it was like a crazy social experiment of like, what will happen? Was everyone just gonna freak out and get super paranoid? Or is it gonna create like a different kind of psychedelic experience? And it was actually more of the latter. I don't think we had anyone get too, I mean, a couple of people did get too stoned and have to go home, but to me, that's not any different from like people getting wasted and having to go home. And we can talk about this more later, but yeah, I definitely noticed some really interesting shifts. and the energy was insane. So
Amazing. Well, let's get into it a little bit just off rip. So how did it change the dynamic? I'm super curious about that, because like I have this joke with everybody that I've worked with running clubs, you know, for the last 10 years, that like I'll be at the club and like I'll have a few drinks or whatever. Like I try not to get too turned up because it's like my own thing, you know what I mean? But like once I smoke weed at my own club, my departure is imminent, because like I'm in that camp that's like I'd be worried about getting too paranoid or like whatever. Like it's probably partially because it's like my own club, so I start overthinking everything and all of this and whatnot. But I'm curious, because you did this like really deliberately, so how did it shift the dynamics? Like what did you?
yeah, so we really thought through very carefully like how to showcase the variety of experience that you can have on weed. So it wasn't just like super high potency strains and joints only. Like we also had like CBD lotions that you could apply on your body and someone giving you a massage. We had this insane, we had a custom mixologist who wrote a book about making weed drinks, and she came up with all of these different cocktails with like different combinations of strains, and some were high CBD and low THC. There was one really crazy cocktail, like a weed martini, where we put Adderall salt as the rim. And that was the one for people who were scared of getting sleepy, you know?
Yeah.
So we had like all these different levels from like beginner to advanced, obviously with the weed Adderall martini as like the advanced level. And I think, you know, I've come to really respect how cannabis has so many different elements to it. Like it's not even just about THC or CBD. Now we have all these other cannabinoids in weed that we're finding out about and are getting really trendy. Like I'm writing about this one called Delta 8 right now. That's like basically diet THC. It's like similar to THC, but more chill. Like you still get stoned, but it's not as like paranoid and intense.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's the perfect cannabinoid for partying. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of how it shifted though, back to your question, I think that weed is really good at helping you like plug into whatever environment you're into. I think that it makes you, you know, more aware and more like sensitive to all kinds of stimulations. Of course, like the extreme version of that is getting really paranoid, getting too plugged in and becoming paranoid. But I think if you can kind of be very mindful about how you're engaging with the substance and just do like a 5 milligram dose or something, it really helps you to kind of like lean into it, which is kind of the opposite for me in terms of when I drink alcohol, I feel like everything becomes blurrier, right? I feel like I'm kind of like slipping through the experience in a really slippery way and not noticing as many things. So, you know, what I love about a really good party is when there's this like hive mind effect of like everyone just plugging in and becoming like this larger sentient being. And I think, you know, the feeling, it only really happens when it's a really good party and everyone's like locked in and the party just kind of like takes off into this transcendent zone. And I think weed is really good for that because it helps everyone to lock in this really deep, you know, almost quasi spiritual way. And I talked to the DJs afterwards too to make sure that it wasn't just me, you know, and I was like, did you guys notice any differences in terms of the crowd? And they all kind of had the same feedback where they felt like it was this deeper connection with people where people were just like really like going in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also, another thing that I'll quickly mention is, you know, the outside smoking patio where we had like sound baths and like food and stuff, like more chill, very conversational. That was the most popping room all night. Like people really wanted to socialize and talk to each other, which was surprising to me because I was afraid that people would get like very antisocial and like be sitting in the corner. I mean, one of the things that I love to do is just be in a super dark room with like strobe lights and you're super stoned down and it's this really intense experience. But like a lot of people just wanted to like sit in the corner on a cushion in a circle and talk to people. And it made me realize that weed is actually a really social experience, because even the act of like passing a joint around, if you think about how that kind of like fills up a space, and it's this sort of like spatial and temporal social experience of like, you know, you create a circle of connection, you know, that's a very social thing to do versus like drinking, where it's like you just have the drink in your hand and it's just you, you know? So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I learned a lot about weed as a social lubricant. It's, I think, very, very new to a lot of people. We're still at the very beginnings of understanding how weed can be incorporated into parties.
Interesting. I mean, definitely I can see the difference of like alcohol fueled partying having this effect of kind of greater and greater shutting down of like how much you're really taking in. I mean, I drink alcohol and I like to drink alcohol, but like, and there's something great about it. It's like alcohol is ancient, you know, it's like, it's been around forever. Like, dude, if you're, especially if you care about what you drink, it can be a deep experience, you know what I mean? But there is something true about, it's an experience of a like narrowing kind of like, you're like blocking out stimuli gradually. You know what I mean? Like you're less likely, like the bad situation on weed is you become over aware, right? The bad situation on alcohol is you stop being aware of shit that you should be aware of. Do you know what I mean? So I fully see that. And I could imagine how that writ large, when being practiced by everybody, would really shift the dynamic of a party scenario, where everyone's becoming more aware rather than being in a room full of people that are gradually shutting down. But
yeah, and you know, I think it's also really hard to be mean or cold to some, like weed makes you goofy, and that was another interesting element that I noticed. Like things were funnier, and like you rarely see people be that kind of like stupid playful vibe at a party, where usually for me, like I feel like there's so many parties where people are trying to just be super cool and it's this like kind of vibe. But with weed, it's just like you're dumb. You know, everyone's being dumb.
Yeah, I mean, the ordinary party thing is like, except for people who are just like really at peace with themselves, but like the ordinary, who are few and far between. But the ordinary party thing is like, you have social anxiety, which gets dressed up as being cool, and then the alcohol comes in to like curb the social anxiety. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of that, like, kind of like surveying the room is just social anxiety with the outfit on that disguises it as like, I'm the coolest person in the room, right? When in reality, that person is probably not feeling that way. Do you know what I mean? Whereas, yeah, I could see that, like the weed thing. It opens you up. I mean, definitely like when you were talking about like the chill zone where people wanted to talk, you know what I mean? And you said it's like difficult to be mean. Those are like both heard, you know what I mean? Really, I can imagine that. That's really interesting. So this opens up onto some interesting topics about partying and about throwing parties and stuff. Like one, I'm just wondering if there's like a broader critique of alcohol in a party setting, like vis-a-vis safe space or things like this, or and then the next question I have is, does it affect the economic model of doing what you're trying to do? Because, you know, a lot of parties, especially parties that happen in non-traditional spaces, are relying on that revenue from the bar. It's kind of a crass question, but I am curious about how that affects the prospects of this.
No, I think that's a really good question. And I'm not afraid about talking about money, because it's important, especially when you're talking about weed, because so many people, weed is like a cash cow, you know. I mean, we should talk about New York legalizing weed too at some point, and how it was a response to budget deficits. But, you know, back to your question, I think that the whole model of alcohol-based nightlife is really tied to revenue and safety. Like those two issues are totally intertwined. And I think for so long, like nightlife has basically profited off the idea that pleasure is inherently linked to alcohol consumption and intoxication. The more intoxicated you get, the more fun you have is the idea, right? And so, you know, I've been leading some interesting discussions about sobriety in nightlife. And I recently did one for CTM Festival in Berlin and had an amazing conversation with a lot of really interesting people from all over the world. And they all kind of, you know, were very interested in how going into post-alcohol could be a capitalist critique or just a way to reimagine nightlife away from the standard alcohol-based sales model. I think for cannabis, like, obviously my ideal would just be to throw parties for free, but that's not really possible right now for me. But my model was a little different in that we were able to keep prices pretty low, like ticket entry, by basically relying on brand sponsors. Like I mentioned earlier, we had like about 20 different brands come through, and they all were super excited to like showcase their products to an interesting audience, because I think what's happening right now in California is it's slowly transitioning. Like when I moved to California in 2018, I started going to a lot of weed parties because I like to experience life through this prism of like partying. And I learned a lot about the industry, but I found it to be very industry oriented. Like it was just all weed industry people who are really into like plant medicines or whatever. And it wasn't really catered towards like street culture, you know, towards like stoners on the streets who actually consume these products. So yeah, I feel like a lot of brands are very excited to be able, there's a lot of really good energy. And at the time, you know, in 2019, there was a lot of like budget going towards how do we differentiate ourselves in this market, especially against like the bigger brands like, you know, Men or, you know, all these other sort of like more corporate weed brands that were really like taking hold in this space. I was focusing a lot more on like mom and pop style brands run by like queer people or women or people of color. And like, that's a huge thing in the cannabis space as well. Like, how do we make sure that this industry isn't just swallowed up by all these conglomerates? I'm a little bit like more skeptical now than I was like 2 years ago about what's happening with cannabis. I think that I came into it with so much optimism to the point of maybe being a little naive about what we could really like change and revolutionize with cannabis. But I think that if you look at what has actually happened, it has been taken over as like a white male run hedge fund based like stock market like industry. And when you look at like the stats behind all of the social equity pushes, I mean, I think it's amazing that social equity and, you know, wiping like the records of people who've been incarcerated is like a part of this conversation. Like in New York, for example, which just legalized weed this week.
Are you serious?
Yes, bitch. Do you not know?
I'm out of town. I'm not like reading the news or anything. Is that's real?
New York legalized weed.
What the fuck? Oh my God. You know, it's like, I knew that was, I'm happy we got this moment on the pod though. I knew that was coming. Like everybody knew it was coming. Do you know what I mean? Because like the CBD thing, it's already fucking everywhere. Like everybody's like just waiting for them to just be like, yes. Right.
Yeah.
But like somehow just, you know, I'm 42. I've lived my whole life with this thing just being like completely senselessly criminalized. it's a crazy thing to hear that, even though it was obvious that it was going to happen, to me, it felt obvious that it was inevitable.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Well,
But
congratulations
it's
to
fucking
everybody.
huge, I think, because New York is a global city, you know, like not to knock LA, but like New York is on a whole other level. And I feel like this will have a ripple effect throughout the world, you know? And people say that New York is the second largest cannabis market in the US after California, but I think it has a bigger market, at least for the underground. Anyway, everyone is just talking about how New York this summer is going to be sick.
Whoa. Yeah, and I'm just starting to open the outdoor hollow iteration for the summer, which we can talk about later. But yeah, all right. So weed. Well, wait a minute. I want to pick up on something that you were saying though, because it's like this is another obvious thing, but it's just something that I hadn't really thought a lot about because I'm not really in this zone a lot, which is that obviously everybody who has been prospecting on this and seeing this coming, like these bigger corporate white male hedge fund Wall Street type entities have been setting up and angling on this for a long time, probably now, or at least the last couple of years. And what you're saying is that you've seen a lot of the space getting monopolized by those actors.
Totally. I mean, before like maybe 2018, there were record numbers of like female leadership in the cannabis industry. And with legalization, that number dropped. So now it's like still higher than average, but it's gone down. And I found an interesting statistic recently that even though the number of arrests for cannabis has gone down, the racial disparity between the types of people getting arrested has gone up. So I think it's really complicated. I don't know if there's hope to steer it in the right direction, but I'm so willing to be proven wrong. And I don't know, I think that it's interesting. Oh, it's so ironic, really, that Cuomo pushed super hard for weed to be legalized because of his own personal political scandals. Literally, like politicians are seeing cannabis as good PR. Like, think about what that really means for the war on drugs. Like, that's insane.
Whoa. Wow.
And also that it's like for the budget deficit from the pandemic, you know? So it's like cannabis equals money to a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the tax alone, like there's obviously going to be some sort of taxation, governmental, so on and so forth. They're going to find some way to make money on this. I mean, for sure.
Yeah, the tax is weird, actually. I just saw also that they did end up pushing through this potency tax. So like you get charged a tax based on the percentage of THC in the plant. So high potency will be taxed higher than low potency. And I really wonder how that's going to change the culture of weed, you know? Like it seems very oriented towards, weed as like Silicon Valley microdosing productivity culture rather than weed as like a transcendent dropout, non-productive activity.
Right. Productive weed smoking. Amazing. So wait a minute. This has been super informative and has everything to do with everything that we're going to talk about. Like clearly I'm like out of the loop, but I want to pivot back towards what you were talking about notions of sobriety and post-alcohol and the conversation that you were having and how these ideas shape the experience of party spaces and that zone.
Yes, I would love to talk about that.
And this is a good time to say that you coined this term CALI sober.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's been kind of like a big thing for you, right? Like that, right? That's been like a talking point, right?
I know, it's been really crazy. Like I have been thinking a lot about why it hit the zeitgeist. Well, let's define it first. So to be clear, the term California sober has actually existed for a long time. But I think that it was defined very differently, or in just, it had a lot of different meanings, but the usual definition prior to when I wrote my essay is people who don't do hard drugs. So it actually included alcohol back in the day. But when I wrote this essay in 2018, saying that I had been experimenting with a drug diet called CALI Sober, I defined it as weed and psychedelics only, no alcohol. And the reason why is because I had just moved to California, weed had just become legal. I was going to all these weed parties, and I was noticing that this was a lifestyle that people here were really, really embracing. A lot of people were not really drinking. And I had kind of come out of like 10 years in New York, partying super fucking hard. Like, we know each other from the music industry. I was like a nightlife journalist. I was out every fucking night, like 3-5 parties per night. Like, it was insane. And I was fueling that with a lot of hard drugs. So I came to California, classic move, just to like dry myself out, to get sober. And I kind of discovered this whole other lifestyle that is very embedded with like the California lifestyle and ideals of like intentionality and spirituality and all these kinds of things. And so that essay ended up blowing the fuck up on a level that probably nothing I've ever written has really gotten that kind of momentum. Celebrities like Chelsea Handler, and actually 2 weeks ago Demi Lovato said that she was CALI sober, and it started like popping up all over the New York Post and stuff again. So I don't know, it really hit some kind of resonance that was obviously larger than my personal story. And I think the more I've analyzed it, the more I've come to realize that the reason why anything really trends in the zeitgeist is because it's a confluence of like several different macro trends, right? Like, I think firstly, a lot of people are really interested in like recalibrating their relationships to substances, especially post-pandemic, when a lot of us have like probably struggled with substances maybe for the first time in your life. I think that the blurring of all the like kind of lines between work and play has made it really difficult for people to regulate like their use. And then two, I think this is kind of related, like recalibrating your substances and having more intentionality towards the kinds of experiences that you're having socially too, and then two, like obviously the wave of legalization around cannabis creates like this amazing destigmatization in the mainstream, where people feel like they can come out of the drug closet and talk about their use and not be shamed for it, like the same people who are shaming people are now like maybe like your mom or your uncle or whatever, now they're like super down to at least try CBD. And I don't know, to me, like the most interesting aspect of CALI Sober goes back to what your podcast is about, which is how do we create new social environments and experiences around cannabis and psychedelics. Like, it's so cool that cannabis lounges and cannabis clubs are going to start opening in New York. Jesus. Like, that is part of the bill. Like, they're allowed to start building cannabis social spaces. And those things don't really exist in America, like you have the Amsterdam model where you go into like a weed shop that's more like a cafe, and then you can buy it over the counter and smoke it with like some coffee. But like right before the pandemic in California, we were getting some really interesting spaces that were nothing like the Amsterdam model. Like, I remember going to the opening of a weed restaurant in Hollywood where they just had like weed infused, like, food, and like, I don't know, just all of these like brunching moms and like teams of like soccer not teens, but like, young, like 20 somethings, and then you had industry people all eating weed together. And it was really crazy. Like, I don't even know how to explain like how mind-blowing that experience was. And then of course the pandemic happened, and all of these lounges that were supposed to open in Hollywood just kind of got stalled. So we haven't actually seen weed social spaces really take off yet. And it seems like New York is the perfect place because of how insane nightlife has been there and how much that industry has really popped off.
Wow, that is really, I mean, that does have a deep effect on social space because like, even though, you know, in my world, I think probably in your world, and by world, I mean like really big, like inclusive of like my parents and my relatives and stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like everybody knows that everybody smokes weed, and like, you know, my family are like Democrats and whatever, you know what I mean? They're not like radical leftists or anything, but they're not like conservative, you know? But I still wouldn't just go to my parents' house and smoke weed. You know what I mean? It just would feel weird to me. It feels like somehow like dirty or like rude or something, you know, to like assume that that would be cool, or like maybe if they didn't care, their neighbor would be freaked out or something. You just this whole energy around it of being something not okay, right? And that by making it just like this like unveiling of it like legally, where you can just enter this space without any legal repercussion, the way in which over time that can shape a social experience, you know, because you're talking about like going into this weed restaurant and there's like soccer moms and like people who, you know, play sports and industry people and like young like weed type folks and stuff all like in the space together, where formerly half of those people would probably not have even admitted to the other half that they even eat edibles.
Exactly. And like, just think about it. You come into this restaurant, some like waitress sits you down, and then the waiter comes up to you and presents you with the weed menu. You know, would you like to order like XYZ strain, or would you like to rent one of our premium bongs? Before they even present you with the food menu, you're like ordering shit from the weed menu, and then they suggest pairings of like, this strain goes really well with this brunch menu item. I mean, it's just so hilarious. And okay, here's like a funny little tidbit that actually like I'm gonna disclose. That weed restaurant ended up getting embroiled in a controversy because some girl went there and claimed that she got herpes from smoking one of the shared bongs.
Oh yeah, well, new kinds of problems.
Exactly.
Well, but bringing this back to like just talking through this and thinking about it being legal in New York, and thinking about what you were saying earlier about your party and your experience at your party. I'm going to take a deeper dive on like the nightlife experience writ large, because like, so as you know, I've been behind clubs and nightlife experiences for like almost 10 years now. Like I've been a musician for 25 years. And of course I grew up in DC on the punk scene. So I've been a part of events since I was 14, you know what I mean? But like getting into like operating spaces for me began about 10 years ago. And I have tried to support every kind of community that I think is even basically legitimate. And to me, legitimacy is like that you really have a community. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think community itself is a kind of wisdom tradition. And like, I support people that have legitimate communities. So that to me means leadership. You support people can kind of come up through it, and people can put something into it and get something out of it, and you take care of each other, right? Like, so if I see that going on, I don't have a particular aesthetic commitment necessarily. I mean, I know what I like and stuff, and if I think something is really terrible, I'd probably try to stay away from it, you know? But my number one thing is like supporting communities of subculture and nightlife practice. Like, that's what I've been doing in New York for the last 10 years. And I absolutely stand by that, right? At the same, for a lot of reasons that we could talk about, we will end up talking about. But at the same time, I have to recognize that like a lot of nightlife experiences are dominated by that feeling among people that we were talking about earlier, where you're kind of standing, or where people are kind of standing around wondering who the coolest person in the room is. or people are just fiercely uncomfortable. They just, you know what I mean? You want it, people want to go to the event, the rave, the party, like whatever it is, because they think it's cool. But there's a lot of like politicking and a lot of like hierarchical shit that ends up getting articulated socially through nightlife, and you know, who's on what bill, who opens for who is in the green room, who stands on stage behind the DJ booth. All of this shit ends up getting kind of codified and can participate in an experience of these spaces that's not 100% positive. Now, I don't want to say that's all I see all the time. Obviously not. I see a lot of amazing, opening, warm, inclusive, inviting shit too. Do you know what I mean? But like, that dimension of the experience that we were addressing earlier is a big part of it. And especially in New York, especially in the major markets, right? If it's you're like New York, Berlin, LA, Tokyo, etc. Right? When you get into like some backwoods type stuff, people are just psyched to be out, man. Like nobody cares about the shit. You know what I mean? But like when you're in a major market and there's a sense that there's really something to get, you could go to this party and meet somebody and it could like change your life, you know, like economically, like that participates into making those spaces a little bit cutty. And I'm interested, all of that is to say that I'm interested in thinking about and hearing what you have to say about how the introduction of cannabinoids could shape that or curb that dimension of nightlife experience. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, totally. I have a lot of thoughts too. So I think that community is a buzzword often that is used to like sell tickets, honestly. You know, like people like love throwing out this word community here, community there. They put it on the fucking flyer, but they don't fucking give a shit, you know? Like it's just a way for them to like generate a sense of like cool inclusivity for the sake of selling tickets. And I think the difference between a community and a scene, because scenes are definitely a thing, you know, like people know each other. You just start to get to know people from just seeing them out all the time. But there's a difference between a scene and a community. I think that a community means that you actually care and that you have the ability to be vulnerable with people, that you feel safe enough to be vulnerable around people, that it's not just about, like we were talking about, you know, this like cool facade of like remove, but you're actually connecting on a deeper level. And that's what makes you care about these people. And I think how cannabis can help with that actually is by facilitating different and slower and more intimate experiences of nightlife that facilitate some kind of emotional exchange that goes beyond just dancing next to somebody, which, you know, I'm not talking shit about, you know, the connection that you get actually from just silently dancing next to somebody. That's definitely a thing too. What I am really advocating for though is expanding the definition of what nightlife is, and what a rave is, to make it more than just reckless hedonism, which I think is what a lot of people associate with that kind of social experience. But you know, at my parties, we always incorporate some kind of discussion series or like or some kind of a panel or like some kind of conversation, because weed is very cerebral, you know. It definitely like stimulates conversation. So that's one way. And I'm interested in kind of like making those conversations more spontaneous as well. So it's not like a top-down, like here are these industry experts talking about something, but something that could just happen. And we always also have some kind of element of, I guess the best word is wellness. Although to me, it's like, it's more just about, you know, having like a yoga. We had a yoga session at the New York Weed Rave that was taught by Sigrid from Flocked, and Earth Eater did the soundtrack. So it was like a collaboration between them. And it was so cool. It was probably one of the weirdest and most avant-garde yoga classes I've ever been to. And to me, that helps you to kind of explore body movement and connection to your body in the same way that you do with dancing, but in a slower and more intentional space. So I don't know, I'm just advocating, I guess, for a more healthy approach to hedonism, something that, stokes like a deeper sense of connection. And I think when you talk about designing spaces, it's really important, I think, to reconceptualize the environment that these parties are happening in, because so many clubs just basically facilitate drinking and like, you know, they're like dark drug dens, literally, you know, like think about the aesthetics of a club like Berghain, which is like what a lot of people associate with like the pinnacle of nightlife. Oh no, there's like rumbling outside my window.
I can hear you totally. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, like Berghain has this like very like post-industrial, you know, wasteland, late capitalism kind of vibe to me, you know, where it's just like the collapse of it's like industrial ruins, kind of that kind of aesthetic. And I feel like those kinds of angles, the dark shadows, like the dark rooms, those are all like cool. I'm not talking shit, but I feel like they evoke a kind of druggy nihilism, right? Like that's the vibe.
And like amnesiac, like, you know what I mean?
Huh?
Like I said, amnesiac, like you have this experience that you like forget, like almost by design, because it's so like overwhelming.
It's like a black hole that you go into, and it's like literally like time and space are distended, and you like lose track of days. And I mean, that's a beautiful experience too, don't get me wrong, like I live for that shit too. I'm just interested in expanding, and like I have been really influenced by first of all, a lot of the pandemic raves that happened. You know, I'm going to leave the moral considerations aside and just talk about how they really took place in guerrilla spaces, often out in nature. And it kind of like recalled like the history of raves always happening in like open fields and stuff like that. And then of course, Burning Man is an obvious one. I mean, it's a cliche, but like I do think that it's extremely like inspirational on many levels, as like the idea of transformation and being embedded into your space. And then you know, a lot of parties that I went to, or festivals in Asia actually, that are really, really eco-conscious. Because I think that when you're doing psychedelics or just super stone, you know, cannabis is obviously a plant medicine too, you really want to be surrounded by like organic shapes. You want to be surrounded by you know, like beauty and even daylight, you know, moving nightlife into day life. It's all just softer to me, maybe more feminized too. And yeah, I think that reconceptualizing the aesthetic experience and the environments helps to create that sense of safety and vulnerability that then facilitates the deeper connection that we're talking about when it comes to community.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much to say in this lane. But one thing that kept coming up for me when you were describing what you were describing is that like nightlife, but also just scene-based art practice writ large is like this kind of horseshoe dynamic where on one end, it's like critical, it's resistance, it functions as critique itself. Do you follow what I mean? Like just engaging the space functions as a form of critique and functions as critical engagement and as a form of resistance, right? And then on the other end of that horseshoe, like very near to the first thing I mentioned, you have something that's like completely uncritical and like I said earlier, amnesiac, this kind of like trend, like this just sort of lift off from any type of real consideration of what's going on around you. Now, when I describe that, I'm talking about things that like you and me would probably never go to. Do you know what I mean? But like but still belong to the family of nightlife, right? Like on the one hand, you have like what your weed rave and other great experiences that you and I have had where we just really felt like engaged and vulnerable and like we were a part of something like in a communitarian way or in a critical way, or whatever. And on the other end of that same spectrum, you do, even though I'm sure, disown this, you do have like the Ibiza neoliberal liftoff from socioeconomic space, like amnesiac kind of like party rocker in the house tonight kind of situation. You follow what I'm saying? Like somehow that is all part of one continuum. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe you don't agree?
Yes, no, I agree. And I think that both can exist at the same time. Even when you talk about Ibiza, like on one hand, you have like these crazy clubs like Circo Loco. And then on the other, you have these like crazy psytrance parties in the woods, you know,
Mm-hmm.
which is more like the old Ibiza, really.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we know where I would prefer to be, but I think that there is something also very cathartic about the experience of being in a giant club with like 1,000 other people. You know, that kind of energy is really insane and something that I've only experienced in Ibiza.
Yeah, I know it's really interesting about like, this is kind of going down its own rabbit hole, but it's like, it's interesting about things being deep. Like I could say this for myself about raving at all, because I got into throwing shows in like a punk way and in like an avant-garde, like outsider noise type. That's where my roots are. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So when I opened Transpicos with Todd in 2013, I was imagining shit that happens from 6 p.m. till 11:30. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, I really, really didn't know about nightlife. Like, I mean, I knew that it existed. I had been to some events, you know what I mean? But really was coming to it from the outside, like in a big way, you know? So for me to do Transpicos and then have Transpicos become the home to the Bunker limited parties, you know, the Bunker has their bigger parties and then they had their Bunker limited parties. So the smaller Bunker bookings for like 200 to 300 people would happen at Transpicos, which was like, you know, that was like kind of my first exposure to that. And in the beginning, I was kind of like, all right, like we got to do this thing to stay open. Like I wasn't like really thinking about it seriously as like music even, really. Do you know what I mean? But then through doing it, I realized I was able to understand like, this is actually a really profound thing, or for these people, this is really profound. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not like, I think from the outside, coming from an avant-garde music perspective, I was like, techno is kind of corny or can often be very corny. Like I was aware of certain things that I liked or like whatever, but I was like, this lifestyle shit is corny to me. Do you know what I mean? But then immersing myself in it, not only did I come to feel that it wasn't just inherently corny, I actually became an enormous appreciator of it. And actually now it's like the other way around. Like I seldomly go to the avant-garde stuff. And when I am up at the venues and stuff that I run, it tends to be for the nightlife stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I've become like an enormous appreciator of it. All of that is just to say that it's like anything, subjectivity is so deep. It's like, you could look at something from one perspective and be like, oh, that's shallow or commercial or something. But then you could be in it and somehow take in what it is and realize that for these people, this is deep and there's something deep about that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think
kind of
that
riffing. Sorry.
The depth of it parallels the psychedelic experience to me, which is why I think that these substances go so well together. You know, it is an experience that can be very challenging sometimes. It can bring up a lot of pain and discomfort. It's also a durational experience, you know. To me, like the longer a party goes, the more you kind of get out of it sometimes. Like, you know, a 12-hour bunker party, like just the experience of being in that space for so long, like you transform a little bit after at the end of it, and it has this like extremely deep sense of like release at the end. It's a journey, you know. It's corny to call it that, but like it's true, it really is. And you know, when you think about like psychedelic trance parties in like Goa, which is where it started, and they were all doing crazy amounts of psychedelics. They were always at least 12 hours.
Right. And
Like
that,
this. Mhm.
sorry, that's something that you don't have in like the band universe. Like you don't have it, you don't not have it at all. Like there are bands that have done like long form type engagements, you know what I mean? And there are important examples of avant-garde music that last for very long periods of time, but very, very dominantly in the world of avant-garde music, in the world of band-based music, you're looking at like a 3 to 4 hour evening divided into 45-minute chunks.
Mhm.
And like in the rave universe, it's the norm. It's accepted as like an ideal across the board that if this thing has to be at least 6 hours, and it's really better if it's like 8 to 12.
Yeah, because you can't get into it if it's only 1 to 2 hours. You just can't lose yourself. You know, it's all about, I think, like ego dissolution as the key to like, you know, the transcendent rave experience. And, you know, when we talk about 12-hour parties, we also have to think about how you can't serve alcohol for 12 hours legally. Like, you're not allowed to serve alcohol past a certain time in most cities. So, you know, it is kind of at least rethinking the financial model for these experiences. If you do a psychedelic, like you take a tab of acid, like it's one tab which costs maybe $10 and you're good for 12 hours. Like, it is less reliant on alcohol sales, although there are, of course, other types of drinks that you can still sell. And like, I'm very interested in this idea of smart bars, which is what they used to do in the 90s, of like different types of elixirs with like vitamins and things that make you feel good in your body. I love that.
Yeah. Well, so this thing that you're talking about now, and you brought up earlier, like that there can be like this dimension of like pain in certain cases, like with certain substances and whatnot, brings up for me like something that comes up a lot, I'm sure for you, and certainly has for me, and something that I've worked with and around a lot, which is like notions of safety, right? Which is like, of course, talked about a lot in the context of culture in general. I mean, safe spaces in the cultural sphere writ large, right? From universities to nightclubs to where people are always talking about this, right? I think about it in a more literal way, like I guess by literal I mean bodily safety, like you're actually physically safe. Do you know what I mean? Like from as a nightlife operator. Not to say that I don't acknowledge those other meanings, but I think as a nightlife operator, I'm dominantly preoccupied by making sure nobody gets physically hurt. Do you know what I mean? Like that's like one of my greatest fears, is that somebody is actually hurt at the venue, right? But like, I'm wondering if the CALI sober idea factors into attitudes about safety, because something that I deal with a lot, and I have said at times, and I wonder about, is that people want to do shit that just fundamentally doesn't seem safe to me. Do you know what I'm saying? Like some of the same people that will be talking about safe space are trying to do shit that I'm like, yo, that's not safe. Do you know what I'm saying?
Can you give an example of?
Yeah, I'll give an example. Like this is a rich example. I was producing a party, and I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not going to say when it was or who I was working with or anything, because I don't want to put anybody on blast. But like, I was producing a party. The party was fundamentally illegal, right? Like in the sense that it was happening in a space that wasn't licensed to do what we were doing, right? Now, it was safe. There's nothing dangerous about the space. It was licensed for occupancy. Do you know what I mean? Like, and anytime I do something like that, I always run it like it's legal. Like, even if we don't have whatever paper permit or something you're supposed to have, I always make sure that like there's multiple egresses, that the lights work, that like all the shit that you would need in order for it to be legal is in place. We have security. We do all of this stuff. Do you know what I mean? So that was all in place. And we were doing it, but like fundamentally it was, we weren't supposed to be doing the exact thing that we were doing in the place that we were doing it in. Okay. So that always adds a dimension of risk, right? Like mainly just financial risk that your party's going to be shut down 4 or 5 hours before you wanted it to be. And like a bunch of people won't be able to play and they'll need to get paid anyway, and so on and so forth. But like, and so then the people I was working with, it's like this confluence of factors. They need to make all this money. So they want water to be free for safety, right? And I actually agree with that, right? But then they want to make all of this money on the bar. So they're like driving all of these bar sales. And really, if you're in that situation, you kind of need to sell water because the whole warehouse model thing economically doesn't work. But whatever, we were giving the water away for free. Then they want to create a safe space for people to do drugs, like drugs. Do you know what I mean? Like not just vaping weed and shit. Do you know what I mean? Like K and MDMA and, but then at the same time, the whole thing is illegal. Do you follow what I'm saying? So it's like this confluence of circumstances where you have this economic imperative to make this thing work financially, which runs against giving the water away for free. But then you have to give the water away for free because people are going to be doing drugs. And then you're actually expediting people doing drugs and like destigmatizing it in the name of safety. But then by the same token, this shit is illegal in the first place, which kind of invites the cops in. And then you've got and this was like an LGBTQIA POC kind of situation. So it's like, there's all these things that it's like, that just fundamentally doesn't sound safe. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like if you just take all of those attributes of this event you're trying to put together and you just stack them all up, to me, it sounds inherently unsafe. You follow what I'm saying? Like, yeah. And it's like, I understand each argument, right? Like I understand giving away the water. I understand destigmatizing the drug use, trying to do it in a safe way so that if something bad does happen, then people are around and it's nobody's just like collapsing in a corner or something like this, right? I understand the necessity to do things in spaces that aren't legal. Like each individual thing I understand, right? But when you put it all together into one event, it's like, that's not safe. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know what to say, like.
I hear you. I think that those are really legitimate points to bring up because people don't often think about how much risk a producer is taking on by throwing these kinds of parties. I will say though that like I usually feel more safe at these like underground warehouse raves or what have you than going to a music festival or club. Especially as like a woman of color who is, subjugated to a lot of harassment or, even like security, like checking you for drugs at a music festival is like so scary, and often security teams at nightclubs or music festivals aren't trained to deal with like other types of bodies or just any kind of like sensitivity around these issues. So I feel like it's a very complicated and sensitive area to kind of dive into. But I think that these like unregulated spaces can feel a lot more safe to people who don't feel safe in the mainstream. That said, I think it really boils down again to community, because I've been to warehouse parties that are completely unsafe as well. And I've gotten shit stolen from me. I've gotten groped, and there wasn't like adequate security or any kind of like protocol to report these kinds of things. So again, like I think it really boils down to the crowd that you're curating there and whether or not they give a shit about what's happening to other people. Like the parties that feel really safe to me are ones where it feels like everybody is like holding each other in like this protective circle, basically. Like if you see someone like passing out in the corner, you're gonna go like bring them to whoever is there to like take care of them. So I don't know. I think that when it comes to cannabis and psychedelics, I get really afraid of both physical and mental safety. I think that there's a higher risk of people kind of having mental breakdowns when they're on like a lot of psychedelics, for example. And sobriety to me is the safest state that you can be in, because sobriety is when you are actually in tune with what's going on. You're not altered in any way. And, you know, personally, when I was doing a lot of my like protest reporting over the summer, and going to a lot of really high risk situations with like a lot of police presence, I was not able to be even stoned in those spaces. I felt very, very strongly that sobriety was the safest way for me to navigate what was all the chaotic, crazy like state violence that was happening around me, and like maybe some bad actors in the protest crowd as well. So that really like helped me to understand sobriety as a safety mechanism, but also a political stance, because what was very interesting about many of these protests, I specifically went to a lot of autonomous zones because I was very interested in autonomous zones as like a spatial protest, and how, well, let me just define autonomous zone. It was basically these sorts of barricaded protest sites where people had like put up barricades and were occupying a space for X amount of time. The most famous one was the one in Seattle. And I was very interested in autonomous zones as a concept because, of course, raves are autonomous zones. And I had been hearing a lot about autonomous zones and Hakim Bey, who came up with this theory through rave culture. But basically, when I was going to a lot of these autonomous zones, the organizers kept encouraging sobriety. They kept telling people to stop drinking, to stop getting fucked up, because it like brought down the legitimacy of the cause, or like we're distractions basically. And I thought that was a really interesting shift from how I thought, you know, the counterculture of previous heydays kind of operated. Like I think a lot about like, you know, how psychedelics were such a huge part of the hippie movement and were seen as like very subversive in some ways. But now with the sort of corporatization of cannabis and soon psychedelics, I feel like sobriety is a countercultural stance. So that kind of dovetails with why, again, I think CALI sober has become very trendy as well.
Interesting. Well, you've covered a lot of ground, which I'm impressed by, and I love that. But I'm gonna like jump across some things.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I'm just like blah. I have
No,
a lot
it's
of
good.
thoughts
It's good.
on
I
this.
love it. I love it when people are going off. That's like my favorite shit. Read the example that I gave. I think it's a super important point that people who feel uncomfortable in normative environments that are policed in normative ways or regulated in normative ways feel more comfortable in environments that are either unregulated or regulated in non-traditional ways. Like when I was first talking about the
Exactly. So I think like the lessons that we got from defund the police, where it's like once you get rid of cops, it can't just be a free for all. We can't have these, to me, I believe, completely lawless places where bad actors can come in and really take advantage of that, you know? And I know so many people who have so much trauma from being assaulted in nightlife with substances involved. And I think what defund and what a lot of the autonomous zones really taught me is that it is crucial for the community to step up and formulate other ways of providing safety and some kind of rule-based structure because you need rules in order for people to feel free. It's like this interesting kind of, not paradox, but dynamic that happens. Like, again, I'm going to go back to Berghain. Berghain is one of the most rule-based club spaces I've ever been to. They're so strict about everything, like from how you stand in line to how you have to act at the door, or there's just so many rules that you have to follow. It's like super militant, but that kind of understanding of what the rules are, which are community based rather than like legal or state based, allows to create this sense of insane freedom. You need to have that foundation, I think, and that foundation can be conceived by the community based on their own needs rather than some kind of top-down system. And I think once you get the community to invest in that way, they are able to regulate themselves.
Right. Well, one of the things I really like about CALI Sober is that it steers, I mean, dominantly, I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but it steers clear of drugs that could have, the word is escaping me right now, fentanyl. You know what I'm saying? Like CALI Sober, you're talking about weed, you're talking about psychedelics, you're not going to end up, you're unlikely. The drugs that integrate fentanyl that I know about are ketamine, MDMA, and of course, like any sort of opioid or something like this. It seems to me that like a CALI Sober diet of drug use would not include a lot of drugs that could be laced with fentanyl.
Yeah. When I was thinking about which drugs have helped me to develop as a person, personally, I feel like psychedelics have been very expansive in that way. I do want to steer clear, though, of what people in the psychedelic community call psychedelic exceptionalism, where it's almost like this elitist stance where you think like psychedelics are okay and all other drugs are bad, I think that that's also kind of a dangerous path to go down, because I want to be really open-minded to people who are able to consume those kinds of drugs and feel like it really benefits them. Sorry, go ahead.
But the reason I said that thing about fentanyl is because you were talking about the Berghain, right? And you're talking about like codes of conduct and rules that are generated by the community that work for them, which enable a wild experience, right? You were kind of describing this, and I was like vibing with that for sure. And then I was thinking about CALI Sober as like a disposition. And it was occurring to me, like that party that I told you about, where they were saying like, well, there's going to be this open place for drug use. Part of what susses me out about that so much as an operator is like any of this stuff, unless you're doing all of this like test kit and all of, you know what I mean? Like you're testing, unless you're testing everybody's drugs, which, for the most part isn't really a feasible thing to do in a nightlife setting, any of that shit.
Why not?
Well, because you're okay, let's say you're operating a legal nightlife establishment, right? I can't implicate the business in any kind of involvement with drugs without running the risk of jeopardizing the entire business permanently. You see what I'm saying? So if I want to take care of this space existing at all, then I really have to take a stance, a kind of don't ask, don't tell stance. Like if I see somebody in the booth at Hollow get out the little spoon, I'm like, dude, you can't, like, I can't see that. You see what I'm saying? I'm not telling you what to do in the bathroom, but once you're sitting there in front of me doing this, I'm implicated, which means if there's an undercover in the room, then the establishment is actually implicated in the like distribution of or use of drugs, which then jeopardizes the very existence of the establishment, right? If I have plausible deniability, somebody goes into the bathroom or behind the club or outside and uses drugs, that's just an issue between that person and the powers that be. That doesn't put the club at any jeopardy at all, right? So now, look, I agree. I think drugs should be legal. I personally agree that having testing stations and all of this stuff and doing this in a more safe way is optimal and should be the case. Okay. But the reality, like boots on the ground, of keeping a space open in a city like New York or LA, you can't come into that type of proximity with those drugs, or else you're implicated. And if you're implicated, it's over. The whole space is done. And then that forecloses on that space for everybody, for all time. You see what I'm saying? Which to me is the greater evil. You follow what I mean? Like fundamentally, the space should exist. That's what I think, right? And then you got to keep a space so you can hold space for these communities and these functions, right? So basically, we need to do what we have to do to keep those spaces in existence, right? Regrettably, one of those things is that I can have Narcan, I could be reactive, right? Like if something does happen that's bad, I can react to it. And this is ridiculous and a complete contradiction and total hypocrisy, but I can't say, hey, if you have drugs that you intend to use tonight, we have a testing station, you can check your shit out to make sure that you're safe. I can't do that.
Yeah, it's so hard because I think that we need drug testing now more than ever because of the proliferation of synthetic drugs and fentanyl and all of the like crazy, designer drugs that are coming out on, dark web kind of sites. I mean, it's so interesting. I really started noticing a lot of, I guess, like synthetic drugs during this pandemic because of the sort of drug supply chain blockages, because of border closures and stuff like that. I feel like other weirder drugs that I'd never heard of were really coming on the scene. And I think that this is a trend that will just continue to proliferate. And so you really can't trust, like every time that I've tested ketamine that some drug dealer has like been so proud of that it was the best shit ever, and we tested it and it wasn't, it wasn't, it literally wasn't.
Like it has fentanyl in it?
No, it didn't have fentanyl, but it was like a derivative of ketamine, or it was a derivative of MDMA. It was not actual MDMA.
Right.
And yeah, I just feel like the drug supply is so diluted right now, and that's such a huge problem. And we know what the solution is. We have the technology to test these things. And I wonder if one potential solution that also is like another trend that I've noticed during the pandemic is to move more into private spaces so that these parties aren't open totally to the public and any fucking stranger can just walk in, because that's a huge problem too. You have all these rando people who are not invested in the community and are just looking for some place to vent and do a ton of drugs. And these are the people who are usually the highest risk because they don't even know what they're doing when it comes to drug use. They're just like trying to get totally loaded. Mm-hmm. And what I noticed was very interesting during the pandemic was like social spaces really shrank and people became much more interested in like intimacy. And that's what the cannabis industry did actually to get around a lot of the legal issues of having consumption on site, is that all of the parties were private, invite only. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, going back to what I was saying, like a lot of them felt very industry oriented because of that vibe, very gatekeepy, but I think there's a way to still do that. I mean, we did that for Weed Rave. Like all of our parties were technically invite only. We didn't put tickets up on Eventbrite or whatever. It was like you had to, I mean, we set up all these different barriers. Like one way was that you had to follow a private Instagram account, and then the Instagram account was how we vetted people, because then you could see their profiles and only then could you access the link to get in, so you can create all these different barriers to entry. And I'm super interested in how people might be able to use other forms of technology, or even going back super old school and dropping like a GPS code or something else to make it feel simultaneously more inclusive and exclusive at the same time. You want to exclude the wrong people.
It's really funny to me that you're talking about this, because I had this same idea during pandemic, and I came up with the phrase for it. So maybe this will be my CALI sober moment, which is neo-intimacy. because it used to be before the internet. So I'm old enough to remember doing subculture and going to shows before the internet, like when you had to just hear about the shit from somebody, like somebody called you on the phone or handed you a flyer, or you saw them somewhere and they said, I'm going to this thing, you should come. And that was the only way you could find out about it. Do you know what I mean? And like, so that had this self-selecting dimension to it, where it automatically self-selected because the way that people found out about things in the first place was selective. Somebody had to tell you. If somebody was talking to somebody that they would really maybe prefer not to see at this event, they wouldn't tell that person. You know what I mean? So it was that selectivity was built into it, right? At this point, if we are going to develop a greater valuation of intimacy, right? Because we're coming off this 2-decade stretch of like crowd shaming and everything needing to be lit, you know, like lit. It was lit, like lit as synonymous with good. Do you know what I mean? Because people do mean that. They're like, yeah, it was lit. They're saying there was a lot of people there and it was really crowded and that's really good. There's like this like conflating of the idea that something that is really heavily trafficked is also really good somehow automatically. That's kind of what lit means, like in parlance, a lot of the time. When somebody says something is lit, they never mean it was bad. They always mean it was good, right? And that's like a really weird thing if you think about that, like especially from a subculture, counterculture point of view, to adopt a perspective that which is bigger is better, right?
Yeah.
Like that's weird, okay? Like that's sus, we should check ourselves. But at this point, because of the mechanisms through which culture is disseminated and the mechanisms through which people learn about events, which is like what you're addressing when you're talking about the private Instagram and so on and so forth, we need to elect intimacy, like very intentionally. Do you see what I mean? Like shit won't just end up being intimate, especially once it's sought after. Like once something is, people hear it's a great experience, it's really good, or there's artists involved that people really want to see, right? You're not going to just end up with something intimate. You're going to have to very deliberately protect that intimacy, right? So that's what I'm referring to as neo-intimacy. Like intimacy is this like radical lifestyle choice, which requires a lot of like defending that space. Do you see what I'm saying? Which is different from what I experienced in the 90s when shit was just intimate because it was just hard to tell people about it. You know what I'm saying? It was like,
Right.
it's like how many people could you call, really? You follow what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, and I think yeah, exactly, that kind of deliberation and self-selectivity creates this sort of different energy that can breed more vulnerability. And I think also what's also very interesting to think about is how to get people invested into these parties. And I'm talking about both emotionally invested, but also financially invested. Like, this is one of the reasons why I'm very excited about what's going on with crypto, actually. Yeah. I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's not really my forte, but I love the idea of collective ownership of parties. Like, I think that if people were literally invested financially in the parties that they go to, then they're moving away from this like receiving, you know, consumerist attitude where they're constantly just like partaking of the nightlife experience without actually giving back to it. And I think if you are like an owner of whether it's a space or a party using crypto, you are going to care a lot more about the values and the people in that space and its development and its future and its safety.
That's super interesting. That's a really, really interesting idea. And it's cool that you're saying this right now and that we're talking, because I'm spearheading a really small space right now. In addition to doing Hollow, I'm spearheading a space that's a basement space attached to another establishment that's run by a art world-based organization. That's like, if you get like 20 to 40 people max, you know what I mean? But like an event with 10 or 15 people is fine. You know what I mean? And I'm doing it because of this intimacy thing that you're talking about, where I'm like, man, this is the shit. Like, little groups of people, like partially coming out of pandemic because people are just freaked out. You know what I'm saying? Not a lot of people want to like be around 500, 1,000 people right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, quick side note, like I've been talking to some friends who've like emerged from their holes in New York and they're starting to party. I personally haven't been to any big parties yet. And I'm like, what's the vibe? Like, what's the vibe in New York right now? I'm dying to know. Is everyone just going buck wild and fucking everyone? And they're like, actually, no. Like, the vibe is very much like, are we okay? Are you okay? Am I okay? Is this okay? You know?
Yeah, no, that is the vibe. That is totally the vibe. And I think, so part of it is that, and it's just pandemic, trauma, safety, optics. You know, there's people who aren't worried about safety, but are worried about being perceived as being irresponsible. There's a whole bunch of reasons, right? Connected to the pandemic, why this valuation of intimacy is on the rise. But I also think that this whole situation did facilitate and enable an appreciation of that which is intimate that has nothing to do with the pandemic. That's just the realization that, like, you know what, having a cultural or aesthetic experience with like 10 people is just a great experience. You follow what I mean? Just like as its own thing. Just forget about the pandemic, forget about safety and all of this other stuff, but just being in a room with 10 people and somebody performs, and like you and those 10 people, like you can have a conversation with everybody that also saw this performance, like that's actually like feasible from a like temporal spatial perspective, is just like a deep, cool kind of experience to have. And I think that people just are appreciating that. They just had the opportunity to realize that like not everything needs to be lit to be good. Like this is actually cool to just be in a small group of people.
Yeah. And I think that smallness really facilitates a modality that I'm very, very invested in right now, which is healing, right? I think I can't separate what happened to the pandemic from what's going on in my life or what's going on in nightlife. It's just impossible. And I think that there's so much grief and trauma that we have to work through together now as we come out of our holes. Like, I'm tired of grieving alone, you know, like I feel like I need to be around other people to process what has happened and what is happening. And these smaller spaces are so amazing for collective grief and like just processing. And I've been to a bunch of like grief spaces held online, and those are always really small, and like even if there are maybe 30 people, the organizer will break them down into even smaller rooms of like 3-4 people. You know, it's always super intimate. And that modality of healing in nightlife is really important, I think.
Well, yeah, I think something that, like, I mean, for me too, just is that I'm realizing as you're talking is that there's like a very important difference between surviving and healing. You know what I mean? And I like, as you're talking and you're talking about being in these spaces and doing the work of healing together in these settings, it's occurring to me that my mental attitude has been one of survival, not necessarily physically. Like I was never that worried that I was gonna die, and I was worried about my parents, I was worried about my wife's parents, you know, but that wasn't that big of a part of it for me, other than the abstract grief that many people were dying, you know what I mean? But just like the whole everybody's life was completely destabilized, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know, thinking about like my daughter's experience and like what was just going on in our lives, right? It's been a constant necessity to adapt and change and put things in place to deal with the fact that something that normally happens isn't happening, and all of that is just surviving. That's kind of what's coming into my mind as you're talking, and that surviving is not healing and surviving is not grieving. And like I could see there being a very, very long tail to this thing that is involved with grieving, and yes, intimacy specifically is adept at accommodating that.
Yeah, and I want to be very careful about reopening nightlife and not jumping into the extreme litness right away, because I think that you need to condition yourself to get to that level, and it can be dangerous to just jump into the fray and start doing shit tons of drugs all of a sudden when maybe you haven't been partying that hard for a while. And like, I've known people who have gotten really harmed actually recently from that kind of abrupt jump. And yeah, I don't know. I think thinking about nightlife as therapy is really interesting to me, because therapy has become so mainstream over the pandemic. It feels like everyone I know is like talking in therapy speak all of a sudden. And I'd love to share with you my experience going to a ketamine clinic recently.
Bring it. I'm here for that.
And how it was a completely different ketamine experience. I mean, I didn't get the treatment because I have to go through like this really extensive patient onboarding process to qualify. But basically, I was just like, this is an insane ketamine environment, because it's so different from other ketamine experiences I've had. I mean, it's kind of like going from smoking weed in your parents' basement to going to a really bougie weed restaurant. You know, it's like the same thing, where I walked into this clinic in Santa Monica by the beach, and it was like a spa. Like they gave you like hotel slippers when you walked in. There was like calm piano music playing. There was like a therapist that greeted you at the door and like brought you to a room where all the walls were hand painted, and there was like aromatherapy customized to your personality. And there were like Buddha statues and expensive water fountains and like moss everywhere. And honestly, it could have just been like a resort if it wasn't for the fact that they are literally putting ketamine into an IV drip into your veins. And yeah, the therapist actually stays with you throughout the experience and makes sure that you're like physically comfortable as you sit in the $1,000 massage chair, and and really like guides you through it. And afterwards, I had a conversation with the guy who, like the director of the space, about how he had designed the space. Because I was like, how did you think through the aesthetics and the decor and like just everything about the way that this space looks when it comes to facilitating a ketamine experience? Because you're really, to me, creating a totally different environment than anything I've seen for ketamine. And he was like, yeah, like we were really thinking about how people want to feel when they are in a K-hole.
So, but wait a minute. What is it for? Like, what is it? Is it taking the perspective that this is, because I know that ketamine is used for the treatment of depression and maybe also other mood disorders like bipolar, et cetera. Am I right about this?
Yeah. So like ketamine is an interesting one because it's currently schedule 3. So you can, well, not you, but like a clinician can prescribe it off label legally. Like it's technically supposed to be used for like hospital surgeries, you know, or like you hear all these really scary stories of like police using ketamine as a sedative to like arrest people, you know. But like you can also get it prescribed off label to treat depression, possibly anxiety. I'm not sure like all the different things that you have to be able to get it. I guess I'll find out when I go through my patient onboarding if it's actually super strict or if it's more like weed where it's like wink wink, like I have this condition and I'm just going to get the prescription, you know. But yes, it is for therapy. And what's interesting about this clinic and several other clinics that are kind of popping up is that they pair it with sober therapy. So like before and after you do the treatment, you also get like a therapy, like a talk therapy session. And the therapists say that it helps facilitate these really profound breakthroughs that usually take like a much longer time to get to that space. You know what I'm saying? Like the ketamine is like a catalyst that helps people kind of zoom out of their victimhood mentality and see things from a distance, because that's what ketamine does. It's dissociative. It allows you to kind of come out of your own experience and see things more objectively. And that perspective shift is like extremely powerful for helping people work through their traumas.
Amazing.
So like, it's kind of cool that, to me, it seems like all of these like therapists and scientists are discovering the therapeutic benefits of a drug that nightlife people and ravers are very familiar with. And I would say that we inherently know how therapeutic these drugs can be. I have so many friends who are self-medicating with ketamine and have gotten through the pandemic through ketamine, you know? But now it's like scientifically justified.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, start like thinking about everything that we've covered in this conversation, like there seems to be this like something that keeps kind of occurring to me is that there's this like inherent wisdom to the cultivation of these spaces as safe spaces, places to be, you know, where, especially I think for people who, for one reason or another, feel less comfortable in normative dominant social settings. And then also the integration of these substances. And there's this kind of inherent wisdom and like healing kind of practice kind of embedded in that. And then there's these other elements dominantly having to do somewhere along the line with money. You know what I mean? Because like when we were talking about the intimacy that I experienced in the 90s and then introduced these means of telling people about things that like make everything into this situation where like things being big becomes synonymous with things being good. Like, how did that happen, right? Well, it's like it's a trajectory that proceeds along a vector that has to do with money. Do you know what I mean? Like the sort of promotion of subculture as a normative dominant lifestyle practice, it has everything to do with money and capital, right? So what I'm trying to get at, maybe rather clumsily, is that at the core of all of these things that we're talking about, there's this kind of wise, enlightened attitude about this social practice and what you write about the, you know, use of these substances and whatnot. And it seems like the effort that is necessary is to somehow, you know, protect that and keep that like free of the drawbacks that get introduced when the like ever-present necessity to somehow make things make money gets introduced.
Yeah, but I don't think that money is bad. I don't think that it's inherently evil. I think that we just have to treat it as more of I don't know, we just have to be more intentional about what we're investing in. And if you think about, I know this is so woo, but to me, money has energetic value.
By woo, you mean Wu-Tang, like cash rules everything around me? Like that's what you're talking about?
No, I mean like being very like LA woo-woo, like
because that's what I thought you meant. Like you're like money has energy, like some like Raekwon shit. Like you know what I'm saying? Like,
great. I love that more actually.
That is kind of what he's talking about, because cream is a slang for money, which stands for cash rules everything around me. So it's like money is just this like energetic process. Or so you understand what I'm saying? Like I feel like we're talking about the same thing. Anyways, go on.
I think so too. I think that we just shouldn't worship it as like the end game. I think it's more just like, how do we shift what we're spending money on and the way that we're circulating it so that we're investing on the things that we actually prioritize and value? Like, how do we use money? Like, I feel like right now, like we've been talking about this whole time, like we are using money to facilitate a kind of alcohol-driven, bar-driven kind of intoxication level of litness that doesn't necessarily align with what we're actually trying to practice, especially post-pandemic with all of the, like we were saying, you know, trauma and healing that needs to happen. So how do we just change the equation a little bit and help people become more invested in the things that matter? maybe through a greater sense of collectivity and community ownership of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually agree with you. And I think that both of us probably in our circles are in the minority in this opinion. I mean, maybe it's different in LA, but like, I personally don't take issue with money. I don't even take issue with capital. I don't think that capital or money are inherently bad. I just think that they are inherent. Do you know what I mean? And I agree that when you allow these processes, that kind of attach themselves to these practices, like subcultural practices and whatnot, to just go unchecked, and you become critically disengaged and less intentional, that's when the sort of like bad stuff that you're trying to keep out creeps in,
Exactly. I think it's all just about intentionality, because like a lot of free parties can feel very not intentional as well. A lot of people just like are like, oh, a free thing, I don't give a shit, I'm just gonna come and like check it out, it doesn't matter, you know what I'm saying? Like that kind of free party vibe can also be very like whack.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you, anything that functions as a barrier normally will have the effect of heightening intentionality. You know what I mean?
Which is why I think it's so interesting that so many parties I've noticed in New York in the last few years, we're creating tiered ticket systems based on your gender or sexual orientation. Like white men get charged the most, straight white men get charged the most.
Yeah, I have a party at Hollow that's $75 for a straight white man.
And that's an interesting way of using money to align with your values, right?
It is. And you know what's interesting? Because I worked that party a couple times, and then I was like, this isn't for me. I mean, I'm friends with those people. I'm on great terms with them, but it's a party for lesbians. It's like that's their thing. It's not just LGBTQ. It's not all of that. It's like lesbians. You know what I mean? And we do like an all-female staff. That's how they want it. I worked a couple of them because it's just so off the rails. It's like 300 plus people. You know what I mean? And I felt like at first, like I needed to be there because I just wanted to make sure that the club was like, okay. And then I was like, you know what, this isn't for me. But just out of respect for their thing, I just felt like I shouldn't be there, But what I've heard though, is that every now and then a straight white man comes and pays $75 and they're actually like fine with it.
Yeah.
They're like, well, sick, dude. Cool. Thanks.
Exactly. If you have the resources and you're able to support the project in that kind of way, then yeah, maybe you are welcome in the space because you value it enough to pay $75.
Yeah. It's interesting.
I don't know. I kind of like want to expand a little bit beyond such an identity politics driven approach to nightlife, but that's like a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other podcast. Yeah. I mean, to just say briefly about that, like it's getting back to what I said at the very beginning of the podcast, is that I'm here to support community. I don't get that into people's stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like if somebody's doing something that I think is hateful or just really physically dangerous or just really disrespectful to my staff or to the people who are at the event or something, I'll draw the line. Do you know what I mean? But like, if somebody has a community and a vibe and they're doing something that's working for them, I try to support it if I can, but I agree with you. But that's me, not me as a person who's holding a space. Do you understand the difference I'm trying to make? Like me, Sam Hilmer.
Bottom line, as we probably wrap up the convo, I don't know. I think that nightlife is going to explode. We're already seeing it. Like we have such an incredible opportunity right now to redefine or just expand the space, because for so long I feel like nightlife, like drugs, have been super stigmatized as like destructive, meaningless behaviors. And thanks to this pandemic, like the number one thing that everyone keeps talking about, even normies, are like, I can't wait to dance. I can't wait to dance. Like everybody is dying to party. And I feel like people have woken up to how partying and nightlife are essential experiences. They're not peripheral. They're really, really fundamental to who we are. And so that kind of recognition and destigmatization opens up the playing field to bring in all these other elements and values that we really want to push forward in nightlife. I think that the hedonistic aspect will always be there. People are definitely going to go buck. But I'm very excited for the other kinds of experiences that we've been talking about, the more intimate ones, the more psychedelic ones, the more healing ones.
Amazing. Yes, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, we've like done the deep dive here. We've scuba dived for sure. And I do think that's like a really amazing place to wrap up. But so amazing to get this opportunity to go so deep with you on so many fronts, you know?
I know, it's so nice to talk to a fellow head about all this stuff. I can't go this deep with anyone. So I appreciate the conversation a lot, Sam. It was so great to talk.
Yeah, 100%. And I will be in touch soon, and I will be out west soon. So we will be in touch.
Cool.
All right. Bye. Peace. All right. Deep Cuts, Michelle Lhooq. Shout out. What a head. Lots of fascinating perspectives. Partying without alcohol, not a bad idea. I'm a fan, but I hear it. People just shutting down, getting Daryl, gradually needing to be escorted to a cab. Shit is a drag. It was cool to hear her talk about how the weed rave opened up this space of conversation and silliness, and people just being less guarded, more vulnerable. Also deep for me to learn that weed has become legal in New York City. That is wild. I've been on vacation fastidiously avoiding the news and any sort of timelines. So I was happy to get put on about that. Next week on Place of Assembly, we begin a 3-episode deep dive on China and Hong Kong. Going to be convening 2 roundtables of venues from China and 1 from a cultural organizing group and a community radio station in Hong Kong, and just taking a look at what's happening there in terms of music, culture, art, organizing, politics, and so on. So hit us up next week, Place of Assembly. Shout out Experimental Sound Studio Chicago and 8 Ball Radio. We're here for it, so see you there. All right, peace.